All right, welcome everyone who's joined. Tradecraft episode 3 is about to get started. It's 10 a.m. on the West Coast on a rainy Northern California morning. If you're somewhere else, I hope your weather is better. This event is being recorded, and I had thought I had created 3 different polls, but apparently what I did was create one poll that has 3 questions. So it is live right now. I'd love to hear a little bit about your level of AML experience. If you're a young, inexperienced investigator looking for some hard skills, you've come to the right place. If you're somebody who's in that middle column, this hopefully will help you with your continuing education requirements, whether those are formal or personal. And of course, we have no storied experts on here, including myself. We can always learn more. I prefer not to use the word expert, but that's just me. I'm Rio Miner. I am your host for Tradecraft. The goal of this series is to give practical skills training back to the investigative community, specifically our financial crime and anti-money laundering investigators is who I'm targeting, although I'm sure lots of folks can benefit from some of the techniques that we are going to discuss throughout this series. If you missed the first 2 episodes, they are available on the refineintelligence.com website. That's my employer. We're building a startup here. This is not a commercial. This is not a sales demonstration. This is designed to help you do a bunch of things. So let's look at our agenda here. We're going to talk about critical thinking. We're going to talk about the life stories that come up when we're investigating anti-money laundering and financial crime alerts. Then we're going to talk about some good ways to get your own experience to kind of leverage your own ability to do this better. We'll give you some hard research tools, look at a couple of open source intelligence tools that can help you with some of your own benchmarking research. And of course, as always, we'll offer you a little takeaway box of some things that you can hopefully implement in your day-to-day life. So let's see. Let's talk about critical thinking. So the first thing, and this is where I was going to launch poll number 2. So poll question number 2 asks, in the AML industry broadly, what percentage of alerts are typically closed as reasonable and not suspicious? So I want to think about both sides of this question. What is reasonable? Now, if you're not super familiar, anti-money laundering investigations tend to kind of go like this. There's some sort of automated transaction monitoring system, and it is pulling down anomalies after surveilling transactions and account activity throughout the bank on a daily, monthly, weekly basis. And based on certain parameters, certain rules, those anomalies are turned into alerts, and then they're brought down and you have to investigate the alert. So again, for example, if it's a large wire transaction, customer doesn't do a lot of wire transactions, that'll kick out as an alert. If it's a large cash deposit or an unusual series of cash withdrawals, those will all kick out alerts. And the thing is that a certain percentage of those are just reasonable for the individual. Maybe the individual or the business doesn't typically trigger an alert threshold and they just had a good week. Or maybe there's an event that happened that caused them to need to move money quickly or move a large sum of money. So a certain number of these alerts that get kicked out, and these can be in the thousands monthly, depending on the size of the institution. Some of our larger institutions, I know a bunch of my old colleagues are on here, and it's tens of thousands of alerts in those type of places. So how do you know what's reasonable? An AML investigator is sometimes tasked with a small group of alerts that might fit your experience, but most of the time you're tasked with picking through all of this transaction activity without a great idea of what reasonable should look like, without what we call a benchmark for a certain industry, for a certain profession, for a certain lifestyle. I know for me, triggering a currency transaction report, which in the US is a $10,000 cash deposit or cash withdrawal, nearly impossible. Okay, haven't done it yet. So the one time that I do it, it's going to be a big anomaly in my account, right? I'm hoping to get there, but I haven't yet. So we spend all of this time digging through transaction activity, trying to catch the bad guys. And, you may have noticed that I'm using the tagline from our company, Catching the Good Guys, because this is what we really want to do. And the industry is doing this, but at a not super a not super efficient rate, right? We know if you look at the reports, if you read the reports, the amount of money laundering and terror financing and human trafficking that we're actually catching is relatively small compared to the volume of transactions that are actually related to this in the world over time. So let's see, I think our attendees have stabilized and about 65% of you have answered the poll. So I'm now going to end the poll. Well, I'll give it one more minute while we talk about this. So the critical thinking aspect is we are spending a lot of our time focused on what the typology of a drug trafficker looks like, what the typology of a human trafficker looks like. And we come up with fantastic behavioral indicators, right? So human trafficking is an interesting one because you can look at things like hygiene purchases and multiple hotel rooms and oversized repetitive orders at fast food restaurants and excessively large, utility bills, water bills, like whatever, right? So these are things that where you can kind of build a transactional typology around it. If you haven't answered the poll, please answer the poll. There's about 79% of you that have answered. Thank you. And I'm going to end it in just a moment and make my point here. So we spend a lot of time looking for these things. I appreciate that. I am someone who has fought terror personally, right? And I've been out there and I spent my life before I joined financial crimes working on intelligence to try to combat some of these things, which I consider to be the worst things in the world. And now I do it as an anti-money laundering professional. And this is my goal. I want to get this activity and make crime not pay. So we wonder, what percentage of the alerts that y'all are investigating are actually being related to these things, right? So I asked the poll and now I'm sharing the poll results. Less than 30%, 5 of you answered that. 15% of you answered it was between 30 and 50%. And 26% of you answered that it was between 50 and 75%. So 56% of you said it was below 75, or that it was more than 75% was accurate. We're catching it, right? If you didn't understand the question, what I'm trying to say is, what are the false positives? I don't like the word false positive either. It's really a non-productive alert. How many of the alerts that are looking for these things by percentage are actually not suspicious? Well, the actual answer is we're catching about 3 to 5% of this on a good day, industry-wide. And I've had BSA officers laugh at me when I said 5% and said 5% is a good day. Now, I recognize that some institutions are doing a great job. Some transaction monitoring systems, some teams are doing a really great job of whittling this down and making this better. But the bottom line is, whatever number you want to put on it, the majority of things that are happening that are causing the workload on a day-to-day basis are legitimate things. They're the normal course of business that somehow exceeded a threshold, somehow did an anomalous transaction to fund some anomalous activity. Because life doesn't happen in normal patterns. So if you look at this word cloud here, these are real responses to real requests for information from a variety of customers. We've done a bunch of this query and response and analyzed the results. And the big ones are things that you might have some familiarity with. Like real estate is a really easy example, and it's one of the ones we're going to go through first. But when you look at some of the smaller numbers, we've got cattle in here. We've got, where's my favorite? Wigs. Somebody was making wigs. Okay, people are making transactions for medical activities. Those don't happen on a schedule, and things like that. So what is reasonable for a wig maker? And what is reasonable for a person in a certain season of life having an unexpected medical expense? And what is reasonable for the guy who's running 3 apartment buildings doing property management half in cash? Do you know? I don't know. I've never been involved in any of those businesses. I've been involved in a little construction here and there, but I didn't touch the money. I was sweeping floors. So it's really hard to know what is reasonable. And the truth is that this word cloud represents like 95 to 98% of what the typical AML investigator is looking at. So it stands to reason that you can either spend your time trying to catch the 3% of people who are laundering money and financing terror, and spend your time really digging through the pile to get there. But if you understand what legitimate looks like to begin with, maybe you can kind of clear away the pile and then focus on what's useful. So like I said, we have done an amount of research. Let's look at a quick heat map, and this is going to guide us for what we discussed for the rest of the presentation. So what we're looking at here is on the first column, these are categories of answers to why somebody did something weird with their money. And on the right-hand side, you can see that we've got it sorted by grand total of the entire population that was analyzed. So 20% of the answers analyzed were gifts, and 0.92% of the answers analyzed were related to jewelry. Okay, so that gives us an idea of how big of a population, like we understand what these ones are. Maybe we didn't get a lot of answers, or maybe these aren't as common. Okay, now the research methodology here, don't send me to Scientific American. We're using a representative sample to try to better understand what is typically a very fluid process. Anybody who's ever investigated fraud knows you get this great set of feedback where you know that it was fraud, and therefore you can model very tightly what the fraud looked like. But with anti-money laundering, my personal experience was that I spent, a good chunk of my time saying, I just can't explain this, so I guess I have to report it because there's no reasonable reason for this that I can figure out. Do I know everything? No. So a lot of my guesswork gets fed back into a SAR prediction model, and we end up doing a good job of predicting what the analyst can't figure out. That doesn't do a good job of predicting what it actually was. So hopefully this gives us a little bit better idea of what it actually was. And it even further subdivides it when you get to the part where you look at what type of transaction it was. So when we look at gifts, okay, most people didn't say they were giving a gift when they were taking cash out. There was a huge chunk of people that said cash in was a gift for some reason, and then the rest of it was mostly wires and wires. And then those proportions change depending on whether you're doing construction, right? We actually got none of the answers were related to construction for cash in or for wire in, but the outgoing was what people were mostly doing, especially cash out. So what we're going to do now is we're going to discuss, I have a couple more stats to show you to explain the type of critical thinking that I think should be done around benchmarking and around understanding what this all means. So what we're going to do is we're going to break down some of these top categories that you see on the left, and we'll talk about indicators that could help you better understand if this is what's probably going on. All right, stick with me here. So another way to look at this is the transaction amounts. And again, you can see that we analyzed a bunch of these different responses. We bucketed them into what we're calling a life story, right? Because like, if I have a life story around real estate, I'm buying a house. I don't know about you, but that's not something I do on any kind of regular cadence. Even if you're one of these families that buys and sells, it's like once every 3 years, once every 5 years, once every 10 years. You don't necessarily do it on a cadence. And so the transaction amount and the transaction type is actually much more telling. You can't really model when I'm going to pull 50 grand out of my investments and immediately wire it to a title company, right? And it's almost always an anomaly in my personal account because I've literally sent like 3 wires in my entire life because I don't necessarily ball that hard. So here we go. Median transactions, depending on whether it was in or out, is also very telling. And this is, if you follow the Refiner's Gold little tidbit series that we're doing, gifts in and out are very interesting when you look at why is there this big difference between it. Between a gift out and a gift in? Well, it's actually explained by age. So one thing that smart transaction monitoring and behavioral monitoring is doing these days is we are trying to bring in different features into the models so you can do more like logistic regression curves and really predict better what's going on. One thing that can help with that is injecting seasonality into the model. So certain different types of businesses, I remember one time, give me a shout out if you remember this one. We did an investigation and we could not figure out what it was. And when we got information back from, I think what the teller had said, it was that the person was a seasonal mushroom harvester out of the Pacific Northwest. So they were literally like, how do you predict that, right? Mushrooms, if you think about truffles, truffles are one of the most expensive foodstuffs anywhere, right? Barring things that are illegal or whatever. So you can, but you could, if you knew that about somebody, you could say, okay, this person runs a Christmas tree farm. That's probably going to have a lot of revenue every November, December, and not a lot of revenue any June. So those are things that we can kind of model in terms of seasonality. But what we've started to see in this research is there is additionally an idea of seasonality throughout life. So there are times in one's life when they tend to be doing more things around employment. Maybe you're going up in terms of your category of employment and your ability to earn and things like that. And then as you accumulate some of that wealth, then you start to step into the era of sort of acquiring assets and making yourself comfortable. That's where real estate tends to come in. Now, I'm not saying that there's no people buying houses or condos at 19. There's whole studies that can be done around certain populations in certain cities where moneyed foreigners are coming in and buying up the condos for the students and things like that. Of course, all of this can be subdivided by zip code and measured against a lot of different demographic data, okay? I'm just giving you an idea of if you were to try to model it seasonally in a lifespan, 44 is more of a median age for real estate transactions than 33 or even well above. Okay, and then as you get into the later seasons of life, that's where investments tend to become more important, and some of those things will get moved around. Maybe you might see big investment restructuring transactions where, you know, somebody pulls it out of one brokerage and moves it to a different financial manager. Maybe as someone's getting ready to retire, they move their money in a big way because they're cashing out IRAs and switching over to annuities, or again, maybe going back to other types of investing. And then when we see gifts, there's a big difference. And again, we showed this tidbit here where the gift in is much smaller than the gift out. Well, that's actually explained because gift out is usually being given by older folks. So they've accumulated assets. Maybe they want to distribute some of those assets before passing away. Maybe they want to, enrich kids' lives because they've got kids that are in this age range and they're doing the real estate thing. And so you might see a large gift out that then gets broken among different relatives, but we don't necessarily see that side of it, right? You only see that the individual relative is receiving a smaller amount at a younger age, and the older person is the one giving the gift, and it's a larger amount at an older age. All right. I want to say now at this time, please feel free to ask any questions. If you want to, feel free to just type those in our Q&A function. I know I'm not unmuting you here today. This is a one-way webinar. So now let's start talking about what are some of the indicators that might surround those primary life stories that we discussed. So hopefully you guys like my AI images here. We'll talk about some big things that might cause people to get big gifts, right? One of those things is a wedding. Again, there tends to be somewhat of a seasonality around when weddings happen, okay? How could you see if someone is having a wedding and guess that if this might be a gift transaction, that's what it's for? You could look at other things, reserving caterers, shopping around at cake shops, dress shop purchases, tuxedo rentals, whatever the case may be. Think about ancillary transactions that support the assertion that one of these things is what's going on, okay? I actually have an article coming out that's called The Shape of What's Missing. And what we're getting at here is if you're looking for a gift and you're looking for a wedding or a business opening or a birthday or a graduation or a holiday or a season that caused the gift, and you don't find any of those things, well, now you can go back to the possibly this is suspicious column. But we know that in huge chunks of the population of your reviews, it's going to be normal people doing these things. So come up with a theory, look for the indicators, support the theory, close the case. That's what we're talking about here. All right, so wedding gifts. There are going to be ancillary transactions related to that. Starting a business was another common category that we heard when we asked, okay, why are you getting a gift? Well, people are starting businesses or receiving additional investments in their businesses. One way to do it is to bootstrap your business. Another way to do it is to get VC funding. Another way to do it is to get relative funding and things like that. So we tend to see large movements of capital around people who are starting businesses. What might you see if someone is starting a business? Well, gosh, I bet you they're going to have a web presence. They're probably blowing that all over LinkedIn. There are things that are going to show you that this person is attempting to open or reinvest in their business, right? So, trolling the web and trolling social media is really important for validating each one of these. And then a graduation is another time where you might have a large gift coming in, right? If somebody's going off to college, that's expensive. If someone might want to go overseas and do some study, that's expensive. One of the things I mentioned, there are these populations of people buying up huge condos around bigger university towns, and it tends to be a lot of foreign investment. So that's where it skews a younger demographic. Well, guess what? A lot of that is also going to be based around starting school and ending school. So are you seeing tuition payments? Are you seeing bookstore payments and electronic purchases and things like that, Best Buy, whatever it is. And then lastly, let's go back to the idea of seasonality. There are certain cultures. I got the red envelopes up there. Okay. That's a thing. It's a big thing that, especially if you have a Western mindset, you might not be tracking that there's the Lunar New Year where people have a tradition of giving larger gifts, right? So you got to think through cultural aspects as well. And I don't say this to in any way be unkind or calling out a culture. I say this because it's super important to understand the mindset and the lifestyle of the person that you are researching, because if the person comes from a certain status in life or a certain culture that is different from yours, then you might not really understand why they have all this money moving around. Whereas in that culture or in that demographic or in that kind of season of life, those may be perfectly normal things, perfectly. All right, enough on gifts. Should we move on? Real estate. So talk about something that causes a lot of anomalous transactions. I'm calling it the typical anomaly, because really, like, even if you are a real estate agent, how often are you buying and selling houses? Even if you are like the mortgage company, how do you even, and somebody honest, that's an honest question for the audience. Does anyone know how you could model any type of real estate activity? I want to say, even for a mortgage company, it would be hard to really model what that looks like, because real estate transactions are they fluctuate so dramatically and they change so dramatically between, this neighborhood on the top left and the neighborhood on the bottom right, right? I mean, these are completely different places that might be 3 city blocks away from each other in some instances. And especially in densely populated cities, it is really hard to tell. Moving transactions, that's not moving money, that's like moving your location, relocating your home is one thing that I would say is a good thing to look for, because legitimate real estate purchases often happen within a certain range of where you were previously residing. And they will definitely have a whole bunch of other transactions around it, okay? You might be depositing cash from garage sales and spending that money at furniture stores. You might be renting trucks or paying for movie services, things like that. Even just a bunch of hardware store purchases could be indicative of fixing up a home before buying it, or I'm sorry, before selling it or after buying it. You might want to fix it up, little DIY action. Of course, around any real estate sale, there are going to be different types of transactions to important entities. Now, different US states have different laws. So certain places, I think the state of New York, you have to use some kind of a real estate lawyer. And so those places, you will definitely see a real estate lawyer involved in a transaction. Whereas in places like California, it's probably direct to or from a title company. You might also see payments to a broker, whether that's a mortgage broker, a real estate broker, a real estate agent, closing fees, appraisal fees. Think about, if you've ever bought or sold a home, how many different things go into that. All right. If you've never bought or sold a home, then take notes. Watch it again on demand later. Okay, and then the investment property versus the moving transaction. I talked a lot about, regular families being able to move and, upgrade their homes or go to a new city for a new job, whatever the case may be. But what about somebody who is just buying an investment property? Somebody made it big in the sales game and they're going out to the woods somewhere near a lake and buying a big fancy cabin. They're putting a ski home up in Aspen. They are finally getting that beach house down in Mexico. How do you track those things? Oh, wow. I'm going to highlight something someone just said in the commentary. So I was talking about how do you map real estate. It's very difficult to map this in terms of how anomalous it typically is. And Julianne, I think, says the volatility of real estate is the basis for mitigating alerts for me. If you could see a pattern, that would be unusual. Fantastic point. The closest I've leaned on interest rates, yeah, interest rates definitely changes the up and down of the market. But what a great point that if you saw a pattern of real estate, that would start to look weird, right? And indeed, I think that that's the next thing I wanted to mention is that we do have to be extremely careful around the source of funds when it comes to real estate, because that is, of course, the thing of all things with anti-money laundering investigations is that you can't launder clean money. And conversely, once you pollute the stream of money, it's very difficult to separate what money came from where. So it all becomes very dirty. The fact is that the source of funds for the real estate transaction should be also reasonable, right? We're looking at seasoned funds, okay? To the extent you can see the brokerage where the investment came from, you want to look at, whether or not these were long haul transactions that got shortchanged or something like that. I'm not using the right brokerage parlance, but the point is like if this was an investment that was meant to be a long growth investment and you're just churning it and catching it out early, that's not an indicator of healthy source of funds. Other things like that. So absolutely, also in every case that we're investigating, look, we know the complexities of trade-based money laundering. We know that integration of illicit funds might go into a house. We know that people are going to purchase and or lease houses for things like human trafficking hubs and safe houses for terrorists and drug stash houses and drug production or grow houses and things like that. So all of these things are still in the realm of possibility, and that's why again I talk about what do we get by exception when we're conducting the investigation. If you see all the moving transactions, if you see all the appropriate amount and timing of title transactions and brokers and people involved, all of that lowers the red flags, right? That makes it look more like one of those legitimate life stories, and you end up feeling happy for the folks. Hey, look, they bought a new house, super cool. One of the other things I mentioned, I don't think I talked about it in the last one, but how do these transactions take place, right? We looked at the heat map, not a lot of real estate taking place within cash. Okay, you might pay cash for like an appraisal. Maybe you're giving your agent cash for some reason. I mean, I live in a very cash heavy economy up here where I live. And a lot of people try to function in that arena where they prefer to be all cash, all guaranteed funds. Cashier's checks is another way that happens in terms of earnest money and deposits and things like that. But still in real estate, it is a low percentage. Actually, you see more people paying rent, more property management, and more construction and remodeling tends to take place in cash versus actual real estate transactions. That's what I've seen. Okay, let's talk vehicles, cowboy. Used vehicles especially are a huge source of alerts I've found, and it is really tough to tell. Again, it's not on the slide, but source of funds, source of funds, source of funds. If you can't figure out where it came from, then that's always a red flag. And if you've heard me talk before, I like to talk about the scales of justice, right? So not being able to validate the source of funds is a pretty heavily weighted red flag, but you got to also look at some of these other things. So registration, obviously, if you have access to a DMV database, I believe all of that is supposed to be public record. You can get it out of one of the paid research aggregator sites. One thing about cars is people love their cars. Even me, I'm not really a self-described car guy, and I love my cars still. And so, especially here in America, probably people are posting on social media. I've taken nice pictures of my beater old truck in the woods just because I like seeing her. And so people put these things on social media. If somebody's buying a new car and they're coming up, they're probably going to have it out there if they have a social media presence. Also, I think the types of transactions you're going to see are going to be very different depending on whether someone is purchasing used or new. Okay, you might see checks, you might see cashier's checks, and you're gonna see a lot of cash when it comes to vehicle, buying and selling. I know every time I hear some good old boy talking about buying or selling a car, I just heard a story the other day. A guy was like, well, they were listing it for $8,000, and I went over to his house with 5,100 and put it in his face, and he gave me the title. And I'm like, okay, yeah, like that's how it happens. That's why I put the AI picture up on there, because literally, you get people that are buying clunkers and fixing them up. I bought a car with cash back in Germany, and they called it the hoopty market, because they were the only people in Germany that would buy old cars were the U.S. service members that were only there for like 3 years, right? So there's this whole market of people who would buy and sell these old Beamers for cash, right? And that's what's going on. So look for it. Fleet versus personal. And again, those new transactions, right? You're going to start to see financing transactions. You're going to start to see ACH payments. I don't know if you have the ability to see a credit check, but people are going to get their credit checked. Things like that. So, and then fleet versus personal. Fleet, by that, what I mean is someone using vehicles for business, right? So if you're researching a business account, right, it might be somebody that needs a bunch of trucks, whether they are delivery trucks or work trucks or things like that. I have a friend who runs a business up in Montana. It's a roofing business, and they have a lot of trucks, and they just wrap them with their business logo, and they're always going back and forth to job sites and stuff like that. So you have to consider where is this activity happening, and what does that look like, and how is it different? Fleet maintenance, fleet gasoline purchases, regular use of these vehicles versus and how that might be seasonal. I mean, so many different things that you can look at to see whether we think that the vehicle purchases seem reasonable or make sense. By the way, here's a plug for using G Maps and Street View. When you're researching these things, I love getting a nice picture of a used car lot. They got the sticker prices in the window. You can do a bunch of benchmarking just by looking at the sticker prices on the windows of the cars in the screenshot that you pulled just by sitting at your desk looking at Street View. So there's a plug for Street View as a research tool. It's not even on my slide later. Made that up right now. Conversions and special use. Boy, I remember researching one company that did some, it's like ambulance conversions or like something like that. I don't really remember what it was, but it was basically taking these vans, like old, like panel vans, and they would build them out with all of this kit and like, cabinetry in the back and the stuff that you would need to make it into like more of a functional work truck than a regular truck, right? And that's hard to do, and it's expensive. And they were moving a bunch of money via wire to go and make this happen. So that's another thing to consider. Special use, the police vehicles, you look at the brand, it's just a Ford, right? It's just a GM SUV, but somebody's going to do the paint job. Somebody's going to put on the electronics, the sirens, the cages, the locks, all of that stuff. So people are doing these things. Businesses are doing these things. Some folks are doing this on the side. People love to work on cars and do little kit conversions, camping conversions, overlander units, tents on the top, you name it. People do weird stuff, and the breadth of that cannot be overstated. All right. Anybody got any more questions or thoughts? We got a few more of these to go through. Let's rock on. Okay. Employment, bonuses, and changes. Look, we're all trying to come up. You might change jobs. How often is the KYC file, the customer due diligence file, being updated on your low and medium risk customers? Sometimes it approaches never, right? Because it's just difficult to get it done. The amount of people that are opening and closing accounts in between that space, et cetera. So you might see somebody that says that they're a student, and you can see ACH payroll from something else. That's gonna change their lifestyle. And by the way, when we did the original bucketing of what it looks like for a 14, 16, 25-year-old student, They're not in the right bucket for somebody who got a really nice job in an office building and started getting quarterly bonuses on their sales quotas. Okay, so you need to think around that and say, well, look, this person's season of life has changed since they opened their account in 1999. It is what it is. Commissions, I will say, are also fairly anomalous, right? It's different than bonuses. Bonuses tend to be something that's like seasonal. It's going to come, quarterly. It's going to come quarterly and things like that. And commissions are going to be more on when you make the sale. And we all know that sales cycles can be variable. Some last a year, some are 3 months, some happen just because you went to a trade show and bam, 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 got a bunch of sales. So you never know. And those commissions and bonuses they might always look like an anomaly depending on how and when they're paid. The good news is that most employers are trying to keep a pretty good handle on what they're paying and when. There's just good practice in accounting with that. So a lot of the time you're going to have a pretty good paper trail around this. A lot of it is electronic transactions. Payroll is, like it's either a check or it's ACH, unless you're trying to avoid something in most businesses. Having said that, there are some businesses we'll carve out, and we'll talk about that one next. Great question from Michael. Can you follow up with catching the good businesses? Yes, I will definitely look at that. And also, I'm going to give you some research tools at the end, because there's a couple of places I discovered where you can look this up. Construction and remodeling. I have done several different little projects at my house recently, and this is a community of workers who love to operate in cash. Okay. I'm not going to say why, because everybody's motivation for different things is different. We do know that people like cash discounts. I have negotiated better rates by handing somebody cash or a guaranteed check in the past. Okay. A lot of times, people like to be able to pay their workers in cash. I don't know what kind of record keeping they're doing. The AML investigator has no idea whether they're paying their payroll taxes or hiring people who are legally allowed to work in the United States. I have no idea. Okay, there are people that regulate these things. And from an anti-money laundering perspective, I think that part of benchmarking my own understanding of this industry is to understand that it is one of the cash intensive industries. I don't want to believe it, but it is. It tends to just run on that. Okay. So let's think through what are some factors that make that happen. By the way, one of the biggest things we learned is that it's cash out that is funding a lot of this. So what does that mean? Ideally, you have a good paper trail for where the money came from. Source of funds is easier to establish, and cash out transactions, in my completely non-humble opinion, are a little bit less risky than cash in transactions. And the reason is because, I'm going to say this out loud. The central problem of the traditional money launderer is having too much cash. If you are structuring a cash withdrawal, the main thing you did is recreate the central problem of money laundering. So while we have to file on it, it kind of doesn't make sense. Okay, it might be tax evasion in some of these cases. It might be improperly paying workers under the table. I don't know. I can't say that definitively. It's probably different in every case. So there is no seasonality to construction and remodeling necessarily, unless you really break it down by zip code. I'm sure there's a lot less outdoor landscaping going on in Minnesota in November than there is in June. One thing I do think is that sometimes these projects can be tied to real estate. Now, they're not always, but if we're looking for ancillary and surrounding transactions to see if this is what's going on, yes, you're going to see Home Depot purchases. Yes, you're going to see large anomalous purchases from what is going to appear to be, supply depots like masonry businesses or gravel businesses, or, some of this weird stuff that you don't normally send $2,000 to a concrete company in your personal account. But sometimes it is tied to real estate, right? And so, Mike, great point. I'm going to mention that. It is sometimes tied to real estate, right? You can imagine that if you're fixing up a property to sell it, that might be a good time to do some light remodeling. You may also surmise that if you just bought a house that was a bit of a fixer-upper, that would be a good time to go ahead and do some of that. Maybe leverage a home equity loan. That's going to create a flow-through transaction where you pull out a bunch of money from a line of credit and then you spend it all at a masonry depot, right? Or something like that. So know that those types of things are going to be tied to this. And then what's interesting, intermittent web presence. I say this about the folks that are doing the work. Oftentimes, the people doing the work are people who, you know, they're not web design professionals. That takes a lot of work to do well. Unless they're a medium-sized or bigger business, they might not even bother to do a website anyway. Sometimes these businesses come and go, right? There may be like, oh, I did my remodeling business for 18 months and then I took off and went to Chile for a vacation for 3 months and I don't have a website. So that's kind of how some of this happens. So I'm going to answer a couple of questions live just because one of them in particular is a really great point from my buddy Mike. Michael, there was recent FinCEN guidance on cash out in the construction world. I encourage you to go get all of your ground truth from people like FinCEN. Always make sure you check with your managers. Nothing I say here supersedes anybody else's guidance. Okay, these are my professional opinions based on the circumstances I've worked through. Circumstances always change. Okay. Lots of payroll tax evasion and underreporting of workers' comp insurance, plus the potential human trafficking aspect. Okay, so Mike is bringing that up, and I want to make sure that I say that I'm not trying to just whitewash and legitimize all of this activity. It is very difficult to tell the difference here. Okay, so still report on the structuring. Okay, still report on it. It might not be money laundering, it might just be tax evasion, and that's also a financial crime. The largest consumer of SARs is the IRS. Okay, so please make sure that you understand the source of funds. Please make sure that you, to the extent you can, you validate and legitimize some of the providers that are doing the work, and understand that it will probably be higher than your normal, belief about cash in these industries. But just as much as I've had people tell me they want cash and they'll give me a discount, I've also had people say, no, I have to have a check for record keeping. So both of those things exist in the industry. Thank you very much for that good point, Mike. I'm going to look at this other lengthy question and see if I can do anything with it for the moment. He's saying some countries don't have a database for citizens. That is challenging. We do rely on what the customer tells us in terms of identity and things like that for the most part. Oh yeah, and checks. Julianne also makes a point that when we're dealing with checks related to construction, usually there's going to be memo lines talking about the purposes. There's great Better Business Bureau is a place to research service providers in the construction and remodeling industry. And and Julianne says if they don't have any complaints or listings at all in Better Business Bureau, then they're probably not working construction. I love this. One thing that definitely legitimizes contractors is having a couple of complaints, because honestly, contracting work is really difficult and there's almost always things that crop up that are going to cause the customer to have some friction. So it's funny how sometimes the odd bit of slightly negative news can actually legitimize someone. I find the same thing when I read requests for information responses. The moment somebody is like, well, I did this, but it's my money, why are you asking? I'm like, oh, well, that's a legitimate answer. Money launderers don't bug me about why I'm asking. They just don't answer. So anyway, business and personal accounts. And Saif, I'm going to answer your question maybe a little later because it's a very difficult question. If you don't have accurate databases in your state or your local jurisdiction, very hard to validate CDD information, a lot of fake driver's license and stuff like that. The national regime there is we rely a lot on what's available in national databases and state databases, and it's unfortunate when there's a lot of fraud in identity and things like that. So business and personal accounts, commingling of funds. Why is this bad or wrong? Well, basically what this means is you're somebody who's running a business and you just didn't bother to or didn't want to open a personal account. So like when I was mowing lawns when I was 14, I didn't open a business account. I just deposited the cash into my account. Now it was carry the one never over $9,000. Okay, it was also never over carry the one $200. So, you know, I wasn't falling afoul of these rules. But the bottom line is, when you have people that are putting business money in and out of their personal accounts, it's almost impossible to keep accurate records. So it's highly likely that these people are going to misreport things just on accident, even if they're trying to do a really good job of keeping records. So most banks have policies against putting business activity into a personal account. It is legal in the United States, at least, to have a sole proprietorship business where you are just running your landscape business out of your personal account. Again, bank policy tends to be a big differentiator here. Remember, a lot of people are going to do side work and seasonal work on kind of intermittent bases. Also, though, legitimate people are always advertising. So like in a world of full disclosure, in a world of every social media under the sun, I make a big case for, like, if you can't find somebody these days, it's really weird, okay? It may not be the determining factor, but most people, if you're running a business, you are advertising, right? I mean, like, how do people know about, you know, my Christmas wreaths that I like to make and sell at the farmer's market? I advertise. I have an Instagram page and I'm all over it, okay? So people that are super quiet about their businesses, that's weird in this day and age. I understand word of mouth is still the best advertising. That's true, but the word of mouth has moved digital. Web presence. Okay, be your own benchmarker. This is where we're going to get into takeaway territory. We got about 15, 13, 12 minutes left. So I'm going to try to get to the takeaways and also answer these questions a little bit better. What do we have here? We have investigators doing the research every single day. You are making a determination as to what that was, and you're filing it away as not suspicious. So my first ask is just be intentional. If you're a young investigator doing this for the first time, really think about, what are these typologies that I've seen that are causing me to not file reports over and over? What is the legitimate story here? We know that legitimate people do weird things that trigger AML alerts. So be intentionable, which is like supercalifragilistic. Be intentional, take notes. You could even keep a very generic non-PII spreadsheet that just says, hey, this was real estate and it was this amount of money and it was this type of transaction. Something as simple as that could help you build a little library of, look, oh, I've done this 10 times and they're always $1 million when I get a real estate thing. And now here's a real estate thing that's $150 million. I think I'll look at that one a little more. Things like that. Mental benchmarks, and I call them gut benchmarks. If you know me, I have a little gut, so I don't mind trusting that thing. I worked hard to build it, and I worked hard to build my investigative gut and understand what right looks like in as many industries as possible. So as an intelligence professional, I was always kind of taught to put myself into the shoes of my opponent or my subject, and really try to flip my perspective. So like, what is it that makes a person do these things that I can't imagine ever doing? And honestly, like, even a convenience store, what is it that happens when you're running a convenience store that I can never imagine doing that, right? I do have a friend whose family runs a convenience store. And so I could probably ask that person. And that's another thing that I forgot to put on the slide, but absolutely positively double, triple leverage your experienced peers. I had a buddy, Chuck, you know who you are. We used to always talk about the construction industry because he had done a lot more of it than I had and actually been dabbled in the business side of it and things like that. So create those mental benchmarks. Maybe keep a little notepad and just, you know, put down some things that help you remember it for next time. By the way, forget about normal. I have in my financial crime life tried to eliminate the word normal from my vocabulary. Do you know what's normal for money launderers, drug traffickers, and human traffickers? Those things. So if someone's done a really good job of making that transaction activity look normal, you're not going to find it. You have to go for what legitimate looks like and then understand that this doesn't look like what I normally see as legitimate. Okay. This is a good time. I will talk about what I learned about how you train the United States Secret Service. The United States Secret Service's primary mission is to protect the currency against counterfeit and other things like that. Their secondary mission is protecting politicians. The primary mission involves training Secret Service agents to understand what real dollar bills look like. You train them and train them and train them on how many hairs are in Washington's nose, how many spiders are in the margins, what's the size of things, et cetera, and what it smells like and what it feels like and what it looks like. And when you're done doing that, it's super easy to spot a fake because you know what right looks like. And then you can say, well, this is not that. So forget about normal, understand legitimate. Hole number 3. This was where I asked everybody to put in their favorite research tools for open source information. That's my little Intel jargon, OSINT, open source information. Look, you have to understand, if you're trying to understand businesses, you might want to understand a little bit about accounting. As I was researching this topic very specifically, I found a lot of industry information that's going to talk about typical benchmarks in terms of business ratios, right? The quick ratio, the cash flow ratios, things like that. If you don't have any idea what that means because you're like me and you took accounting 6 months ago for the first time, then you're going to want to know a little bit about it. Now, there's some great industry articles out there, and I'm going to show you that. There's also some pay transparency sites if you're researching individuals in professions you've never really seen. And then, of course, you're always going to default back to some of those paid sites. So I found this fantastic article from JPMC that has a ton of information about exactly what I'm talking about. What are cash flows like? What are balances like in different types of small businesses? So I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. I am right now going to put this into the chat so that you can feel free to use somebody else's free resource. How do I chat? I want to send this to everybody. All right, there's the link to this site. The other sites you can find on your own. But look here, this has, it's not exactly super new, and certainly some of these things changed, but it explains some of the methodology so you can educate yourself to the extent that you don't maybe understand the business terminology here. And then you can just read through and you can look. I mean, this is a great graph here that talks about different major categories of businesses and how much outflow and inflow they might be experiencing on a different, time schedule basis. I find that if you can go in here and look at some of these things, you can say, aha, hey, look, actually, this really validates one of the things that we find is that average daily cash balance, it's always 10 grand in construction. I know this is a huge deal in tax evasion and things like that, but the numbers bear it out. This is what people are doing, whether it's for good reasons or not. And then you can get into things like cash buffer days and what this looks like on a time schedule in terms of the number of days. You have to go back and understand what a cash buffer is by reading this chart. Anyway, everybody's got the link. Now you can check it out on your own. If we're researching individuals, has anybody ever checked out Glassdoor? Glassdoor is a place to go and just research job titles and locations so you can see if somebody's salary or bonus sort of seems reasonable. And I found another one like that called payscale.com. And you have to create accounts for these things and you have to answer some of their little surveys and things to get in there. But if you want to, you can even just type in different job titles. And I'm not saying these are 100% accurate. I have no idea, but these are places where you can look. And benchmarking isn't about being 100% right and having a hard line. It's about having, some wickets and say, well, this is kind of the left and right limit of what I would expect here. So let's make sure that we are actually within that or close to that. Okay. So those are some of my OSINT research tools. We have about 6 minutes left. Nobody works out in 6 minutes, but let's look at our takeaways. This guy's taking some stuff away. Critical thinking is critical. Look, I can't say it enough. I will repeat it until I stop giving these webinars. You have to try to understand what's going on the other side of the transaction sheet, okay? My perspective is not super useful in terms of what I think is reasonable, because for me, $10,000 in or out is never reasonable. Okay, so I have to change my thinking based on the person I'm researching. That's an intelligence mindset that I push in this industry. Look at both sides of the question. Think about it from the standpoint of if 95% of this is reasonable, let me come up with a hypothesis and let me use that hypothesis to then gather ancillary information. If I think it's a legitimate real estate transaction and I'm not worried about where the money came from, let me gather 3 to 5 pieces of data that support real estate. If I think it's a gift because it's that time of year or it's that season of life, let me gather 3 to 5 pieces of information that might support that. Okay, things like that. You're always going to have to use the scales of justice to weigh it out. There is no magic bullet. That's why we hire highly intelligent and well-educated people to do what can sometimes be a mundane job, because so much of this is art and not quite science. Art of investigation, you got to develop your gut instincts and take notes and be intentional about learning from your own experience. Okay, and then lastly, I will just say, try new things. One of my old mentors used to say, click on something new every day. If you guys know him, you know who he is. And I will say, click on something new every day. You're probably not going to break it. Control Z is your best friend. Okay, if you're working with a data set and you want to try something new, copy the sheet and make a new sheet. Okay, and things like that. All right, let me answer a couple of questions now, because I did have a couple of them come in. How do you guys like my AI presidential portrait from the 1800s? Just, if I get one laugh and it's not just me, I'm happy. Okay. Let's see. Curiosity is king, says Michael. Great. This was great. Melinda, I appreciate you. Julianne, you made the point of the Better Business Bureau. I answered that. And let me discuss this. We had a guest from the Middle East. Thank you so much, Saif, for your comment and question. It is very difficult to tell. Saif asks, between banks and financial institutions, how can you tell whether or not someone is legitimately who they say they are? Right? It's very difficult in some countries where the national database or the provincial database is not actually very accurate. And so there's a lot of forged documentation and things like that. I think in cases where you can't get the government to do a better job combating the counterfeits, or they don't have enough security features in the identity cards, then it relies a lot on training the bank staff and the financial institution staff on the anti-fraud measures. So counterfeit and counterfeit documentation and recognizing those things is an art and science all its own. And maybe I can get an expert to do a webinar on that. That would be a great Tradecraft webinar. But suffice it to say, it's important to show folks what a real ID looks like and benchmark that. And then it'll be easier to understand what a fake one looks like. Maybe it's flimsy paper. Maybe the photograph isn't done correctly. Maybe the background and the watermarks are wrong, things like that. So the better that we understand, again, what legitimate looks like, then we should be able to spot a fake. Thank you again for attending, especially all the way across the world. I notice I have a bunch of folks who may be across the world. Thank you all so much. This has been Tradecraft, practical skills for your analysts, investigators, and other financial crime professionals. Thank you so much for attending. This will be available at refineintelligence.com on demand under our resources section. And stay tuned in the new year. We will definitely be doing this again. Stay tuned for episode 4. I'll put out what that's going to be. And that's all for today. Cheers, and thank you all very much.